Part 18. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wu Nian. Chapter 171. Dead. When Chen Tao saved Johan before, he had seen the blue code that the corpse turned into. And now the blue code on Bai Yao's body is exactly the same as the corpse. Death. As a warrior with third-generation genes, Bai Yao will also die. Doesn't it mean that after reaching the third generation, he will not die? What's going on? Chen Tao said, Xingyun, analyze Bai Yao, I want to know what changes have happened to her body. Instruction received, analyzing a mechanized voice came to my ears. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Analysis completed. Chen Tao said, is she dead? Nebula said, dead. Chen Tao frowned and said, what's the reason? Her body does not match the fourth generation genetic code, and rejection occurs, which ultimately leads to the death of the original gene and the dissipation of the fourth generation genetic code. This ultimately leads to death. Chen Tao said, Cardi has successfully upgraded using the same code, why can't she? After Cardi's body has communicated with its master's genes, the body has the conditions to be upgraded to the fourth generation of genes. After that, the code upgrade will be done naturally. A mechanical voice sounded slowly. After hearing Xingyun's explanation, Chen Tao understood. The current technology of the dragon civilization is not enough to master the fourth generation genetic ability, so Katie just handed over the code she didn't understand to Bai Yao and asked Bai Yao to upgrade it. But in fact, Katie didn't know about another process, that is, the close contact between Chen Tao and Katie during this period has given Katie the basic conditions for evolution, so that Katie can easily advance to the fourth generation of genes. But Bai Yao is different. Her body does not match the fourth generation code. This happens naturally. Chen Tao was silent for a moment, and then said, Xingyun, recode Bai Yao and upgrade her to the fourth generation. Instructions received, recoding in progress. Chen Tao watched as the code on Bai Yao was being cleared and then rewritten. After rewriting the code, Bai Yao can restore his previous posture, which is equivalent to resurrection. For Chen Tao and Xingyun, death is no longer scary. But, the feeling of watching a dead person being resurrected made Chen Tao feel weird. Especially when that person is still a familiar person, the weird feeling is even more overwhelming. In any case, even if Chen Tao has the ability to resurrect, he will never allow those around him to die. It took Chen Tao half an hour. Nebula is finally finished. Time resumes its passage. Chen Tao looked at Katie beside him and said, it's done. Katie was startled, and she nodded slightly. For Chen Tao, it was half an hour, but for Katie, it was just a moment. Of course, Katie knew about Chen Tao, and she also knew that Chen Tao must have repaired Bai Yao through the other world just now. Not long after, Bai Yao's eyelashes fluttered. She frowned, slowly opened her eyes, and slowly sat up. She covered her head with her hands and shook her head. Then she looked towards Chen Tao and Katie. She with a hint of doubt in his eyes, he looked at Chen Tao, why are you here? With that said, Bai Yao looked at Katie and said, did I upgrade successfully? Katie came over, sat next to Bai Yao, and supported Bai Yao with her hands. She said, you failed and then fell into coma. It was Chen Tao who saved you. Bai Yao was slightly startled, looked at Katie, and then looked at Chen Tao, why is this? Katie also wanted to know this question, so she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, after Katie's body communicated with my genes, she already has the conditions to upgrade the fourth generation gene. As long as the fourth generation gene code is imported, she can upgrade. But you are different. Speaking of this, Chen Tao didn't say any more. Both women are smart people and they can both understand. Bai Yao pursed his lower lip, then looked at Chen Tao and said, in other words, if others want to use that fourth generation code for genetic upgrade, they need to do it with you. Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, "That's not necessarily the case. As long as I help, you can advance to the 4th generation of gene bodies even if you don't do that kind of thing." Bai Yao closed her eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Thank you." "Well." Chen Tao responded casually, "Then my mission is completed, I'll go back first." He looked at Katie. When Katie heard this, she looked at Chen Tao and nodded slightly. Chen Tao withdrew his gaze, and his figure disappeared into thin air. Looking at the place where Chen Tao disappeared, Bai Yao remained silent for a moment. Looking at this scene, Katie said, "Fortunately, he is here." Bai Yao slowly lay back, looked at the ceiling, and said, "The enemies outside the universe have technology that our dragon civilization does not have. They can completely use energy weapons that we don't know about. We attack. We can't hurt them, but they can hurt us at will. If our technology doesn't improve, and if we continue to rely on Chen Tao, one day, Chen Tao will no longer help us. Then who can help us maintain the balance of the universe?" Katie looked at Bai Yao, but she didn't speak either. Frankly speaking, as for the 4th generation gene, she has not upgraded it since she obtained it, just because she did not understand this gene and wanted to spend more time analyzing and understanding it. But the threat from outside the universe was too great. That threat forced her to choose to upgrade directly before she fully understood the genetic structure. This is why Bai Yao is in this situation. There is no way to do this. After all, they have to maintain the balance of the universe. Kadi thought for a while and said, "If Chen Tao is willing to become the king of our dragon people, our overall technology can be upgraded to a higher level. He has the genes of creation. If he is willing, our technology can once again lead other civilizations, even those outside the universe." Bai Yao looked at Kadi and said, "Didn't you say that he doesn't want to?" Kadi nodded slightly and said, "Well, Chen Tao is not interested in power. He is not the kind of ambitious person. He is indifferent to fame and fortune." Bai Yao retracted his gaze, looked at the ceiling, and said, "Then there is no way. I can persuade him again and see the effect," Kadi said slowly. A week later, Chen Tao lay lazily on the big bed, looking at the ceiling above. His eyebrows stretched slightly. It was very peaceful during this period, and Chen Tao spent 7 days leisurely. During these 7 days, Chen Tao did what he wanted to do, and the process was very leisurely and enjoyable. This was the life he longed for. But sometimes, if you are leisurely for too long, you will feel a little boring and uninteresting. Chen Tao was a little bored. "Dear," a voice came from the side. "My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 172. Chen Tao looked sideways. A woman has ink-like hair tied up. She wears a black fishnet top and a thin white gauze skirt that fits her mature figure. She has bare feet, but even without shoes, her figure is exceptionally good. Tall. The waist is grasped, and the waist is proud. One leg is long and straight. This enchanting and beautiful woman is none other than He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan sat next to Chen Tao, with a smile on her charming face. In her hand, she held a plate with a meatball that looked like a rose. He Yuxuan said with a smile, "This is a kind of delicacy I got when I went to that food planet. This kind of delicacy has very magical effects, and it is also delicious. My dear, come and try it." As he said that, He Yuxuan took the spoon and put the meatballs into the spoon. Chen Tao slowly sat up and leaned against the bed. He was about to speak. He Yuxuan had already brought the meatball to his mouth. Chen Tao could only open his mouth and eat it. It melts in the mouth and enters the body along the throat. A sweet fragrance fills the mouth and tongue. This taste is very special. Chen Tao said, "Well, it tastes very good." He looked at He Yuxuan and said, "Just now you said that it has special effects. What effects?" He Yuxuan showed a smile and said, "It can make you, an extremely cold man, extremely passionate. As she said that, she snuggled her body into Chen Tao's arms. She looked up at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Doesn't it feel magical?" For a moment, Chen Tao felt his body begin to heat up. Now he knew what the magical effect of this thing was. He turned over suddenly, pushed He Yuxuan under him, then looked into her eyes and said, "If you do that kind of thing, it seems I have to punish you today." He Yuxuan was startled and her face turned red. "That won't work." She looked a little more panicked and said, "We need to find more sisters." Chen Tao looked into He Yuxuan's eyes and said with a playful smile, "If you cause trouble, you have to solve it yourself." He Yuxuan said, "Good people, don't mess around." She was a little uneasy and nervous, and her face was flushed. Chen Tao had no intention of messing around. He really didn't expect that He Yuxuan would do such a thing. Does He Yuxuan doubt Chen Tao's ability? This made Chen Tao feel provoked. Therefore, Chen Tao decided to punish her well. Early the next morning, Chen Tao got out of bed, wrapped himself in a bathrobe and put on a pair of slippers. He looked back at He Yuxuan on the bed. He Yuxuan was still sleeping, lying on her side with her eyes closed, looking like she was sleeping soundly. Chen Tao withdrew his gaze and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. "Look at the scenery outside." Every time he wakes up, he likes to come here and look at the scenery outside. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Chen Tao has always been pursuing a leisurely and stable life, and he has achieved it. Now he has what he wants and a lot of time when he wants. But now Chen Tao feels boring. In other words, is there nothing to do now? Chen Tao slowly sat down, sitting on the chair, looking at the scenery outside, in a daze. If a person stands too high and there is no challenge, he will feel bored and boring. In these million years, I have always felt like this. A voice suddenly came from beside me. Chen Tao turned his face and saw that it was Katie. Katie was wearing a suit of armor, with a red cape fluttering behind her. She looked at Chen Tao. Meet Chen Tao's gaze. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't dress like this when you get home." Upon hearing this, Katie blushed slightly and her armor disappeared. She put on a thin gauze skirt. Chen Tao held her hand. Katie slowly sat down next to Chen Tao, nestled in Chen Tao's arms, and was gently hugged by Chen Tao. She leaned on Chen Tao's shoulders, looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, and said, "I used to feel boring. Do you know? It's so uncomfortable and lonely to be so high up there, with no one around to accompany you, and no one to even talk to." Hearing this, Chen Tao looked into the eyes of Katie beside him. Katie continued, "It's very painful. Sometimes, a thought will even flash through my head. If I die, if I will be liberated, I will be able to relax." Katie closed her eyes and said, "It wasn't until I met you and became the woman I love you that I discovered that living is such a happy thing. Having your company is a very beautiful thing. For a million years of boring words." She opened her eyes, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "In your arms, being comforted by you, being held by you feels wonderful." Chen Tao smiled, hugged her slender shoulders, and said, "If you like, I can hold you all the time." Katie pursed her lower lip, shook her head and said, "No, although I want to stay in your arms all the time, I have responsibilities." Speaking of this, Katie said, "Actually, in Dragon City, many female dragons are like this. They live a boring life every day, and even regard themselves as complete warriors. For those female dragons, it is more glorious to sacrifice for the balance of the universe, but for me." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Actually, many of them are tired of the boring life and want to use death to pursue some excitement." Chen Tao frowned slightly. "You mean, many female dragons are seeking death on their own?" This statement is not very good. After all, female dragons are willing to pay the price of their lives for the balance of the universe. But if Kadi said so, Why do the lives of those female dragons who sacrificed feel worthless? Isn't this tarnishing the honor of those female dragons? Kadi said, sacrificing for the balance of the universe is their honor, but it does not rule out the possibility that some of them are too weak to endure loneliness and seek death on their own. She looked at Chen Tao and said, this is why I want to make the gender balance in Dragon City. Chen Tao was silent for a while and slowly frowned. Maybe, sometimes that kind of loneliness is terrible. Kadi looked at Chen Tao and said, husband, actually, I want you to rule Dragon City and become the new king of our Dragon City. Chen Tao looked at Kadi. She looked at Chen Tao, in that case, you can open a back garden in our Dragon City, and then take the female dragons you like into the back garden. In this way, you can also give those female dragons a thought. Back garden, this refers to the back palace of the ancient emperor, right? Kadi said, you drove away the powerful force from the outer universe with your own strength. For many girls in our Dragon City, you are a hero. You are the one they admire and love. If it were you, they would definitely be happy to accept it. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 173. Katie's proposal is so crazy. It was so crazy that Chen Tao couldn't believe it. But if you think about it in retrospect, it's not difficult to understand what Katie was thinking. In the Dragon City, there is too much imbalance between men and women. Many female dragons even choose to commit suicide in order to get rid of the loneliness and boredom and know their own lives. If Chen Tao is willing to take over the Dragon City and build a back garden, it will be equivalent to an outlet for the loneliness and boredom of those female dragons. But this is still crazy. With a normal modern mind like Chen Tao, he could understand it, but he couldn't accept her proposal at all. Chen Tao said, everything else is good, but asking me to manage Dragon City is not good at all. Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, well, hubby, as long as you put your name on it, Dragon City will still be managed by me. As for the back garden, you can still build it? Chen Tao smiled bitterly, looked at Katie, and said, my dear, are you planning to let all your sisters in Dragon City share your husband? According to Chen Tao's thinking, there are women on Dixing's side who wish that their man only had eyes for her. Kati, on the other hand, wanted to turn all the female dragons in Dragon City into Chen Tao's property. This is too exaggerated. Katie blinked, she smiled, and said, I think this is good, so that the sisters in Dragon City will not be lonely, and at the same time, it can quickly restore the gender balance in Dragon City. Chen Tao's head suddenly felt as big as a bucket. He raised his hand and scratched the bridge of Katie's nose. Katie wrinkled her nose and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. Chen Tao has not thought that Katie really has the intention to turn all the women in Dragon City into Chen Tao's property. Only the values of civilization are different, which Chen Tao cannot understand. He stood up and said, let's not talk about this anymore. Is there any movement outside the universe recently? Katie sat on the chair neatly. She said, the universe is normal during this period, there is nothing unusual. Chen Tao nodded slightly and said, that's good. By the way, Chen Tao turned to look at Katie and said, are there any dragons in our universe? Dragons appear in various places in mythology, but so far, Chen Tao has never encountered one. Now that he was idle and bored, he asked to see if there was any. Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, yes. Have. Chen Tao said, where? Katie said, our dragon civilization currently lives in an artificial mechanical planet. Before us, we were not an artificial planet, but a real planet. In that primitive planet, there were dragons. But Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, now the planet where the dragon civilization was originally located has been destroyed. Except for our dragon civilization, all the creatures in it have become extinct, including dragons. Chen Tao touched the back of his head. In other words, there is no more? Katie said, in addition to the primitive planet where the dragon civilization lived before, there are dragon-like existences on other planets. However, dragons are of no use. Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, dragons can also be regarded as highly intelligent genetic bodies, but the problem is that they are very lazy and do not know how to use technology, so they cannot conquer nature and will only be conquered by nature. Without the help of technology, they have wings, but they cannot fly out of outer space. Those creatures can walk sideways on the planet against some cold weapon age civilizations, but against pre-nuclear civilizations or above, they are relatively large. Just food. Chen Tao hummed and said, I'm idle and I'm going to take a look. Katie's eyebrows relaxed slightly, she smiled, and said, it's good to look at the situation in other civilizations. It's just that my husband, Katie, has things to deal with, so I guess I won't be able to go with you. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, it's okay. He raised his hand and gently stroked her hair. Feeling Chen Tao's tenderness, Katie snuggled into Chen Tao's arms, raised her face, and kissed Chen Tao. She looked at Chen Tao reluctantly, then came out of Chen Tao's arms, opened the micro wormhole and left. Watch the tiny wormhole slowly disappear. Chen Tao looked away. Husband, do you want to see a dragon? A voice came from beside me. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked towards the source of the voice behind him. When he looked at Chen Tao, he realized that He Yuxuan had woken up. She was sitting at the head of the bed, her hair a little disheveled, and her face a little lazy. However, there was a smile on her face, and her big eyes looked at Chen Tao expectantly. Chen Tao said, well, what? Do you want to go? He Yuxuan smiled and said, of course I do. She pulled back the quilt and got off the bed. When he came down, his feet were unstable and his body fell down. Fortunately, Chen Tao had quick eyes and quick hands and caught her in time. He picked up He Yuxuan and placed her back on the edge of the bed, letting her sit down. He looked at her and said, what's wrong? He Yuxuan blushed and gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes, it's not all your fault. Chen Tao smiled, you can't blame me for that. That was your punishment for provoking me yesterday. He Yuxuan snorted reluctantly. Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan. He smiled, sat next to her, gently held her shoulders and stayed with her. He didn't think much about it. He Yuxuan's body had third-generation genes. No matter what the injury was, it would heal automatically after a while. She is probably just feeling unwell now. Chen Tao raised his hand, and a screen with blue code appeared in front of him. He used his genetic ability to search for dragons in the known universe. Not long after, the screen showed a picture. Through the picture, you can see a huge monster. This huge monster is lying deep in the woods. It looks like a big lizard with a pair of wings. Even if it is lying, its body is as tall as a two-story building. The scales are very huge, and it has a pair of dragon wings and dragon horns. Is this a dragon? So magical. He Yuxuan's eyes are shining, she said, it looks so handsome, completely different from the fake dragon seen in the movie, so cool. Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan, He Yuxuan's eyes were shining, it seems that she likes it very much. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled and said, if you like it so much, let's go over and ride it as a mount. Is it okay? He Yuxuan looked at Chen Tao, her eyes full of expectation. Chen Tao smiled and said, of course. He Yuxuan started, she couldn't help but raise her face, kissed Chen Tao's face, and said with a smile, this is a reward. Chen Tao was happy, he said with a smile, the reward is here, so I have to be more serious about this dragon hunting plan. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 174. He Yuxuan quickly stood up, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Then let's set off." Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan, who was full of expectations. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Before setting off, I think you should put on your clothes first." He Yuxuan was startled. When she looked down, she blushed and said, "Well." Chen Tao changed his clothes. After putting them on, He Yuxuan was almost done. Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan in front of him. He Yuxuan changed into a white shirt with a pair of blue jeans, and wore a pair of black cylindrical high-heeled boots. The close-fitting casual attire perfectly complements her slender, tall, and proud figure. Her hair was tied into a single ponytail, exposing her white neck. The whole person looked sunny and energetic. When she grasped her waist, her upper circumference was not as exaggerated as Zi Qing's, but the width was graceful. Looking at the girl in front of him, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He Yuxuan smiled and said, "That place is in the wild, so I changed into clothes that are convenient for movement and can also prevent mosquito bites." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "I have evolved you to the third generation of genes, so mosquitoes can't bite you. However, this is pretty good." He Yuxuan was startled and said, "Well, if I had known better, I wouldn't have worn so many clothes." She came over and gently held Chen Tao's arm. She looked at Chen Tao with big eyes and said with a smile, "Then let's go." Yes. Chen Tao raised his hand and opened a miniature wormhole. The two stepped into a miniature wormhole. As soon as they stepped into the wormhole, the two figures appeared in a primitive forest. As soon as Chen Tao stepped into the forest, Chen Tao immediately smelled a rotten smell, which was like the smell of rotting trees. There are so many woods here, and it's not surprising that some are rotten. The soil under Chen Tao's feet was a little damp. It probably rained not long ago. He Yuxuan looked around. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "My dear, where is the dragon?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "The woods here are too dense. We can fly up and have a look." Yeah, He Yuxuan responded. The ring on Chen Tao's finger turned into white light, fell behind Chen Tao, and turned into a pair of white wings. He looked at He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan also had a pair of wings behind her. They looked like the wings behind Big Z, but there was no purple thing. He Yuxuan said, "This is what Bai Zi taught me." Not unexpectedly, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay, let's fly up and have a look." He Yuxuan hummed. The two spread their wings and flew into the air. Roar! Suddenly a dragon roar sounded. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao raised his eyebrows slightly, and both he and He Yuxuan flew in the air. Chen Tao looked forward and saw a scene that made Chen Tao's eyebrows stretch slightly. The giant dragon directly in front was roaring angrily. Beside the giant dragon, a group of men and women, riding a flying creature, holding bows, arrows, and long spears, were attacking the dragon. This scene gave Chen Tao a sense of novelty. "What are they doing?" He Yuxuan looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "If the guess is correct, they should be hunting that giant dragon." When He Yuxuan heard this, she said, "Well, that must be the civilization of this planet." "Well, let's take a look at the situation first," Chen Tao said. He Yuxuan said, "Okay, hunting dragon." Seeing this novel thing, He Yuxuan was also interested in watching it. At this time, Chen Tao noticed that 6 men on flying mounts were unwilling to go out, gathering on top of the giant dragon. There are 6 people below who attack alternately to attract the dragon's attention. The 6 men above suddenly separated. A huge net was pulled open instantly. The 6 people below saw the scene and immediately dispersed. The big net made of huge ropes spread out. It enveloped the huge dragon. The dragon's body is wrapped in a net. Roar! The giant dragon was caught in the net and struggled wildly. "Muen, do it!" Suddenly, a woman frowned and shouted. Okay, the strong man named Muen looked like a bear. He held the thick and long spear, drove his flying mount to fly past the giant dragon, and pierced the dragon's back with the spear. The spear sank into the dragon's back. Roar, the giant dragon screamed. It struggled harder and harder, and its huge body crushed several big trees. But because it was entangled in the net, its mobility was greatly reduced. After Muen pierced the dragon with his spear, he took another spear from his companion and attacked the dragon again. The other two men flew over, tied the spear that had just been inserted with a rope, and pulled out the spear. As soon as it was pulled out, the dragon's blood dripped. Roar, the giant dragon screamed again. Muen attacked the dragon again. The spear thrust in and pulled out again. What are they doing? He Yuxuan frowned slightly, then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, I think they are bleeding the dragon. They want to use this method to consume the dragon to death. It's really smart. This thing cannot be hit head on, but while it consumes blood, it also consumes the dragon. With just a little bit of physical strength, this behemoth can slowly die. This dragon seems to be just a little bigger, He Yuxuan said. It can't breathe fire, it can only struggle. This kind of dragon is still different from the dragon in our legend. Chen Tao nodded slightly, he agreed with He Yuxuan's statement. If this dragon can breathe fire, then the net made of thick rope will not be useful to the dragon at all. The 12 people obviously cooperated and planned. The behemoth was bleeding too much, and its physical strength was slowly exhausted and fell down. Seeing this, Chen Tao lost interest in the dragon for a while. It seems that this dragon is just like this. Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan beside him and said, the dragon is gone, let's go. He Yuxuan's eyes were shining, and she said, yeah. None of you can leave. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind Chen Tao. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao frowned slightly, and he subconsciously looked back. But he found two women riding on mounts not far behind Chen Tao, holding bows and arrows in their hands, aiming them at Chen Tao and He Yuxuan. They looked alert, and seemed to regard Chen Tao as an enemy. The clothes these two women wore were the same as those of the dragon hunting team, and it was obvious that these two people were also members of that team. Chen Tao didn't want to disturb the civilization of this planet, but he didn't expect to be pointed at by the civilization of this planet. Although it was just a bow and arrow, it was a weapon after all. Being pointed at by a sharp object, Chen Tao felt a little uncomfortable. Who are you two? What is your purpose in entering the territory of my Kayada clan? One of the women frowned and said coldly. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 175. He Yuxuan looked at Chen Tao and said, honey, what should I do? She was a little excited, because He Yuxuan knew very well that apart from the fashionable flying mounts, this world was actually a cold weapon civilization. The weapons of this civilization wanted to hurt as for her as a third-generation gene, or Chen Tao as a sixth-generation gene, that is basically impossible. But He Yuxuan was interested. She wanted to see how Chen Tao would handle this matter. Chen Tao could just turn around and leave with He Yuxuan, but Chen Tao was in no hurry. It's boring to go home, so why not play with them? Chen Tao looked at the two women and said, we were just passing by. The two women looked at each other and then looked at Chen Tao. Yulu, what should I do? The woman said. Mu Yin, I don't know either. Another woman said, the queen is here, let me, the queen, handle it. As she spoke, her eyes fell behind Chen Tao. Queen. Chen Tao looked behind him and saw that the female commander of the dragon hunting team just now was flying towards here on a flying mount with the man named Mu En and another man. When Yin Lu and Mu Yin saw the woman, they said in unison, Queen. The female conductor nodded slightly, her eyes falling on Chen Tao. Chen Tao also noticed the female conductor. This woman was wearing silver armor, and her body was basically covered by the armor. Although she was wrapped in armor, it was not difficult to see her slender and tall figure. Only one face was exposed, and that face had exquisite features and was full of heroic spirit. One look and you can tell she is a strong woman. The female conductor stared at Chen Tao and said, "Men and women with wings, where are you from and who are you?" Chen Tao looked at the female conductor. He crossed his arms and said, "Then let me tell the truth. We come from the sky and came here. We are only interested in dragons, but we didn't expect that the prey would be snatched away by you." The female conductor squinted her eyes, looked at Chen Tao and said, "Heaven? Do you mean you are a god? Here we go again." Chen Tao said, "I am not a god, you and I are just humans." "Humans living in the sky," the female conductor frowned. Chen Tao said, "Yes." The female conductor pondered for a moment and said, "What's your name?" Chen Tao said, "This is my woman, her name is He Yuxuan." He didn't hide either. After all, there was no need to hide. He just wanted to see what the female conductor would do. The female conductor said, "Since you introduced yourself, let me introduce myself too. I am the Queen of Kayada, Valia." Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "You said that the purpose of your coming here is for the dragon. Then I will give you the dragon we hunted. What do you think?" Queen Muan on the side frowned and said, "This person only has an extra pair of wings compared to us. What qualifications does this person have to let us give him the dragon we just hunted?" Muan was obviously dissatisfied. Vilya said, "Shut up." Upon hearing this, Muan opened her mouth and slowly closed it. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. The queen looked quite majestic. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "How is it?" Chen Tao said, "I am interested in dragons because I want to try the feeling of riding on the back of a dragon. The dragons you hunt can only be eaten now. I am not interested." Vilaya frowned slightly and said calmly, "Okay, there is an evil dragon not far away from here. We can take you there." Chen Tao smiled and said, "You're so kind, but that's not necessary. I'm not very interested in your dragon right now. I feel it's too weak." Yes, after seeing these people hunting dragons, Chen Tao felt that this dragon was just a giant lizard. It was just a bit bigger and of no use. A dragon that couldn't even breathe fire was really useless. No wonder Katie said that dragons are useless. Chen Tao has no interest in such a dragon now. Haha. Muan curled her lips disdainfully and said, "If he said he was interested in dragons, I think he was lying. I think he was just afraid of facing the dragon and afraid of death. He also said that he came from the sky, which is really shameless. I think his enemies came from other places to spy on our situation." Muan looked at Vilya and said, "Queen, these two people are a big problem. Why don't we arrest them?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao's heart skipped a beat. Misunderstood. It's no wonder that he was misunderstood. After all, Chen Tao just said that he came for the dragon, but now he changed his statement inexplicably. If the person were replaced by Chen Tao would also misunderstand. Chen Tao had a headache. "Why don't you just leave here?" "No, just leave, it's too boring." Chen Tao decided to stay and see how things develop. Vilya held the reins of her mount in her hand, and raised her other hand, signing for Muan to shut up. Muan closed her mouth. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "We Kayada are all hospitable people. You are a guest when you come from afar. Come to our place to have something to eat and take a rest." Wei Lia stared at Chen Tao with vigilance and suspicion in his eyes. However, Chen Tao still admires this woman. Chen Tao felt suspicious that this woman could still be so patient. Chen Tao could feel an aura from this woman, an aura that only a king could have. Before, Chen Tao had only felt this kind of breath from Katie. Interesting. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay." Chen Tao is interested in trying exotic food. Wei Lia looked at Yilu and Mu Yin. When the two women saw this, they put away their bows and arrows. "Let's go," Wei Lai rode on his mount and left with the people. Chen Tao and He Yuxuan followed. He Yuxuan looked at Chen Tao and said, "Honey, do we really want to go over for dinner?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan and said with a smile, "Isn't the food from a foreign country quite interesting? I think you were very fond of food from other places before." He Yuxuan smiled and said, "Of course I like it, but I feel a little strange." "Husband, didn't you have little interest in other planets before?" Chen Tao touched the back of his head and said, "People will change. Mainly because it's boring. Although it is comfortable at base 1, it is too boring, dull, and boring." "Humph, you said a lot of words that others can't understand." Mu N curled her lips and said, "I have already seen that you are the enemy's spies. Just wait, I will let you show your flaws." Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Mu N beside him. Mu N stared at Chen Tao coldly, raising his head, quite proudly. Chen Tao looked at the man. Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, "Come on." Seeing Chen Tao suddenly smile, Mu N was stunned for a moment and frowned. Chen Tao withdrew his gaze and faced Mu N's firm suspicion. What Chen Tao felt was funny. Vilaya on the side took the scene into consideration, slowly withdrew his gaze and looked ahead. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 176. Following Vilya and others, we came to a primitive tribe. When we arrived, a huge bonfire had been lit in the tribe, and simple tables and chairs were placed around the bonfire. The tables and chairs were already filled with a lot of food. Vilya and others took their seats. Chen Tao and He Yuxuan were also arranged in front of a table. Chen Tao and He Yuxuan sat at the table. On the table were 2 pieces of roasted meat wrapped in green leaves. They were not eaten, but Chen Tao could smell the aroma. In addition to the roasted meat, there was also an iron cup with red wine in it. Chen Tao held the cup in one hand and the roasted meat in the other. He first looked at this food from another civilization. After looking at it, he took the roasted meat into his mouth with a try-it attitude and ate a piece. The taste was very light, without any seasoning, but it was very fragrant and tender. This meat was good meat. Although there was no seasoning, the simple barbecue with the tender meat tasted very good. After eating a bite of barbecue, he put it down, then picked up the wine glass and took a sip. A spicy taste went through his throat, entered his body, and then suddenly went back, rushing straight to his nose and brain. This wine is too strong. If Chen Tao was not already a 6th-generation gene body, he would have fainted in front of them after taking a sip of wine. Chen Tao looked at Vilya, who was looking at this side. She took a sip of wine in her hand. This woman looked thin, but full of heroic spirit. She drank this kind of strong liquor that ordinary people could not stand, but her face did not change. She was very calm, just like drinking ordinary boiled water. Puff, suddenly, Chen Tao heard a sound from his side. Chen Tao came back to his senses and looked at He Yuxuan beside him. He Yuxuan covered her mouth with her hand, frowned, and said, "It's so spicy, what kind of wine is this? It's so choking and spicy." Seeing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile, raised his hand, and slowly stroked He Yuxuan's back to comfort her. Although she was already a 3rd-generation gene body, she seemed unable to bear the wine. After all, after upgrading her gene body to enhance her own genes, her sense of taste was still the same as before. This wine could not hurt He Yuxuan's body, but the taste still made her uncomfortable. Feeling Chen Tao's movements, He Yuxuan looked at Chen Tao and said, "I have drunk a lot of wine in our place, but this is the first time I have drunk such a strong wine." Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly. "Haha, "That's the wine our soldiers drink." Valia laughed out loud and said, "Only those who drink it often will understand its deliciousness. Ordinary people can't bear its strong taste." Chen Tao nodded slightly. Valia smiled and said, "Originally, this dinner was a celebration banquet for our return from hunting dragons, and now it's just right for you to come. This celebration banquet is just right for you to welcome you," Valia said, raising the wine glass in her hand and comparing it to Chen Tao. Chen Tao also picked up the wine glass. Valia retracted her gaze, raised her head and drank the wine in the glass in one gulp, and then showed the empty wine glass to Chen Tao. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Does this woman mean to finish the wine in one gulp? This woman is really amazing. She can finish such a strong wine in one gulp. As a man, Chen Tao certainly can't admit defeat. He moved the wine glass to his mouth and raised his head. The wine entered his mouth. It felt like a ball of fire entering his throat. But it doesn't matter. Chen Tao is already a 6th-generation gene body. Let alone wine, even if he swallows magma into his mouth, it will not have any effect on him. After drinking, Chen Tao moved the wine glass to Valia. Looking at the empty wine glass, Valia smiled and said, "It's worthy of being a person from heaven. It's really amazing." Chen Tao smiled and put the wine glass down. At this time, a girl holding a wine pot came over and filled Chen Tao's glass. While doing this action, the girl raised her little face and looked at Chen Tao. There was a trace of worship and admiration on her delicate face. Meeting the girl's eyes, Chen Tao's heart moved. Did the girl like him? Was it because of the glass of wine just now? Chen Tao smiled slightly and said, "Thank you." The girl blushed slightly, nodded slightly, and then stood up and left. Humph! Suddenly, a cold snort sounded. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao saw Muen, who stood up, picked up the broadsword on the table, walked out, and then looked at Chen Tao and said, "It's too boring to just eat meat and drink. Brother, how about we have a competition and a contest? It's just a good opportunity to have some fun, how about it?" Competition. It's better to be a challenge. Muen has always been unhappy with Chen Tao, thinking that Chen Tao is a spy sent by the enemy. Now that he has this opportunity, Muen will naturally destroy Chen Tao. Let others know that Chen Tao is just a lying bastard. After hearing what Muen said, everyone's eyes fell on Chen Tao. In this primitive society, sparring is a common thing. In a sparring, the strength of each other can be determined, and the status between people can be determined. If the challenged party refuses to spar, it means that the challenged party is showing weakness and is defeated without fighting. Everyone wants to know whether Chen Tao will choose to accept or refuse Muen's challenge. Chen Tao naturally knows what Muen thinks. He looked at Muen, and then at Valia. Valia said nothing, just looked at the side quietly. For a moment, Chen Tao understood Valia's meaning. This is what Valia is aiming for. She has been waiting for this. As a king, Valia has to be patient. Although she also doubts the truth of what Chen Tao said, as a king, she cannot arrest Chen Tao directly because of her suspicion. She needs real evidence. And now Muen, who is hot-tempered, has made such a fuss, which just gives Valia the opportunity to judge. Chen Tao can't help but admire this woman. She is worthy of being the queen. No wonder Valia has such prestige among this group of people. Her actions and so on all show that as a king, she has the courage and guts. Awesome. Chen Tao looked at Muen, he slowly stood up, looked at Muen, and said with a smile, "Just sparring, of course." As he said, Chen Tao walked out and walked in front of Muen. He looked at Muen and said, "How do you plan to spar?" Muen held the hilt of the broadsword with one hand, and pulled the cloth tied to the broadsword with his other hand, revealing the sword inside. He stared at Chen Tao and said, "Take out your weapon and fight me to see who is stronger and who is weaker." Muen narrowed his eyes, picked up the heavy broadsword with one hand, pointed the tip of the sword at Chen Tao, and said, "I think you are a spy sent by the enemy, an enemy of Qaeda, and I, Mu-En, am Qaeda's first warrior. You dare to stand up, I admire your courage, but if I am sure that you are just a spy sent by the enemy, this sword will never hold back. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 177. "Take out your weapons," Mu-En shouted in a deep voice. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He showed a smile and said, "I'm not used to using weapons like yours. Just attack me directly. Let me see what you can do." Mu-En snorted, "Okay." As soon as he stepped on his foot, his huge bear-like body and terrifying muscles expanded when he exerted force, and his feet sank into the ground. He stepped on the ground and used his strength to pounce on Chen Tao. He clenched the broadsword with both hands and swung it suddenly, slashing from top to bottom towards Chen Tao's shoulder. If Mu-En were an ordinary person, he would probably be smashed into pieces instead of being chopped into two pieces. Aha! There was an unusual sound. The broadsword in Mu-En's hand suddenly split into two, and a broken blade flew into the air, turned several times, and fell to the ground with a muffled sound. Mu-En kept swinging the broadsword down, but the broadsword in his hand was only broken. He looked at the broken sword in his hand. Mu-En's pupils were trembling slightly. He raised his face and looked forward. Chen Tao was surrounded by a small half-moon blade weapon. The weapon didn't fall to the ground, and no one was holding it. It was just surrounding Chen Tao strangely. Mu-En's pupils trembled slightly, and his face was filled with astonishment. Then, "What is that?" Everyone couldn't help but stand up. Ba bang bang. Suddenly there was a sound of applause. Chen Tao looked at the source of the sound. Wei Lia stood up, she was clapping her hands, with a smile on her face, and said with a smile, "Well, you are worthy of being a person from the sky. This hand has made me sure. Mu-En is not your opponent." Mu-En was slightly startled. He frowned and said, "Queen, I can still fight." Vilia frowned. She glanced at Mu-En and said, "Don't be stupid. His weapon just cut your weapon into two pieces. If he had wanted to, he could have not cut your weapon, but kill you. Do you think your body is as strong as your sword? You have already lost this fight from the beginning." Mu-En opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but after looking at the small half-moon blade surrounding Chen Tao, he closed his mouth and threw the broken sword in his hand to the ground. Pa Mu-En looked at Chen Tao, saluted, and said, "Sorry, I was too suspicious." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said with a faint smile, "You are not wrong to be suspicious. If it were me, I believe I would also doubt myself." Mu-En was slightly startled. He looked at Chen Tao and then sighed slightly, ashamed. He lowered his head and turned back to his seat with a depressed look on his face. Chen Tao retracted the half-moon blade, turned around, returned to his seat, and sat down slowly. Wei Lia looked at the scene and said, "Chen Tao." Chen Tao looked at Wei Lia. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "I wonder if you are interested in staying in Qaeda." After seeing Chen Tao's strength, does Wei Lia plan to keep Chen Tao? Chen Tao said with a smile, "Thank you, Queen, for your kindness. I'm just passing by and won't stay here any longer." Hearing this, Wei Lia pondered for a moment and said, "What a pity." Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "If you have anything you want, just tell me. As long as you ask for it, as long as I have it, I can give it to you." She looked at Chen Tao, her clear eyes revealing a trace of strange feelings. Noticing the change in Wei Lia's eyes, Chen Tao felt a familiar feeling. Just like Rose and Lin, who first fell in love with Chen Tao, they looked at Chen Tao like this. This is the queen. How could such a high-ranking queen fall in love with her so inexplicably? Illusion. Chen Tao thought this was probably an illusion. He thought for a moment and said, Well, I really do have something I want. What? Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao, her eyes shining slightly. Chen Tao said, I've traveled to many places with your flying mounts, but it's really rare that you use living creatures to fly. If possible, I would like one to try out the feeling of riding on them. Vilaya nodded slightly, okay, but it's already very late today. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, we can discuss this matter tomorrow, okay. Chen Tao was slightly startled, then nodded slightly and said, of course. Wei Lia smiled and said, then let's enjoy this dinner now. Okay, Chen Tao smiled. Dinner is finished. Wei Lia arranged a place for Chen Tao and He Yuxuan to live. Chen Tao and He Yuxuan arrived at their residence. This is a room, very spacious. If it's not as good as Chen Tao's room in base number 1, it's still a pretty good room in this civilization. Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at Chen Tao, her face was full of joy. Chen Tao smiled and said, this bed is probably not as soft as ours. If it feels uncomfortable, we can go home and sleep and come back in the morning. He Yuxuan smiled slightly and said, I quite like the feeling of resting somewhere else, and, I think something will happen tonight. If you go back to base number 1, that thing probably won't happen. Why do you say that? Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan. He Yuxuan said, husband, did you just notice the way the queen looked at you? Chen Tao was slightly startled, what look? He Yuxuan said with a smile, that look is like someone's heart has been captured. She is interested in you. Otherwise, why do you think she would deliberately keep you here? Stay, indeed according to what He Yuxuan said, Wei Lia did intend to keep Chen Tao. Chen Tao wanted a flying mount. This kind of thing was just a piece of cake, but she said she would wait until tomorrow morning to deal with it. Obviously, she planned to keep Chen Tao for one night. But the problem is, Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan and said, I showed my strength in front of her. As a queen, of course I hope to have as many strong people around me as possible. She wants to keep me, doesn't she just want my help? No, 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 He Yuxuan said, I can be 100% sure that she is in love with you. Chen Tao smiled bitterly and said, okay, since you don't want to go back to base number 1 to sleep, then sleep here. Yeah, He Yuxuan said happily. At the same time, in the Queen's palace, Wei Lia stood by the window. She looked at the moonlight outside through the window. She closed her eyes and Chen Tao's face appeared in her mind. Vilia slowly opened her eyes. Queen, a voice came from behind. The speaker was Vilia's lieutenant, Chad. Vilia said calmly, did he leave? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 178. No, Chad said, he is resting in the room we prepared for him. Queen, do you want him to be your man? Chad asked. Vilia said lightly, for many years, I have been tired of this boredom and loneliness, and I want a man who can control me. In order to find this man, I searched all over Kayada, but there was no one. Now I have met him, and I will certainly not give up. Very strange. Vilia has possessed extraordinary strength and leadership since she was born. Her strength makes her almost have no opponents. Muin, who is regarded as the first warrior of Kayada, is not Vilia's opponent. Vilia is very strong and confident. But the stronger and more confident she is, the more she looks down on the opposite sex. In Vilia's eyes, none of the men in front of her can match her. So, Vilia is looking for a man who can control her. Up to now, Vilia has searched all over the north, but she has not found it. And now she has found it. Yes, it is the man named Chen Tao. She can feel the strength of that man. Whether it is strength or character, he will be strong. She wants him very much. Thinking of this, Vilia took a deep breath, she picked up the sword on the table, went out, and said, don't follow me, This matter can only be done by me alone. Yes, the guards responded one after another. Chen Tao didn't know Valia's thoughts. He was lying on this strange big bed, looking at the strange ceiling. The bed was padded with animal skin, but because the weather was a little hot, it was not padded too much. The bed was a bit hard. But Chen Tao didn't hate it. As a person in the slums, Chen Tao used the hard wooden bed most often, and he was used to it. The reason why Chen Tao couldn't sleep now was that Chen Tao rarely slept in strange places. And he was not so sleepy, so naturally he didn't fall asleep. Looking at the ceiling, Chen Tao was in a daze. Dong dong. Suddenly, there was a sound at the door. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao slowly sat up and said, "Who?" "Chen Tao, it's me." Valia. Valia's unique noble and indifferent voice came from outside the door. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao was puzzled. The queen came to see him alone in the middle of the night? It's really strange. I'll tell you. He Yuxuan's smiling voice came from beside him. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao looked at He Yuxuan beside him. He Yuxuan was lying on her side, looking at Chen Tao with a smile on her face. Chen Tao showed a helpless look, pinched her nose with his hand, looked at the door, and said, "Is there anything the queen needs?" "Yes, there is something. Is it convenient to come out and talk?" Valia said. Hearing this, Chen Tao pondered for a moment and said, "Okay, please wait a moment." Then, Chen Tao got out of bed and put on his clothes. When he came to the door, Chen Tao opened it. As soon as he opened it, Chen Tao saw Valia, who was still wearing the armor and carrying a sword. Valia is tall, about 1.72 meters tall, wearing a pair of high-heeled boots, which makes her tall figure stand out. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Follow me." She turned around, turned her back to Chen Tao, and walked forward. Chen Tao followed Valia. There were two flying mounts in front. Valia rode on one of them, then looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao's sight fell on the other flying mount. This thing has a body like a lion, a head like an eagle, and a pair of huge wings on its back. "The name of this mount is Lion Eagle," Valia said. "If you don't have this mount, you probably don't know the name of this thing." Chen Tao nodded slightly, and he turned over and sat on the back of the Lion Eagle. Valia pulled the reins, and the Lion Eagle flapped its wings and flew up. Chen Tao looked at Valia's actions, and he also held the reins and pulled like Valia. The Lion Eagle spread its wings and flew up, flying into the air. Valia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Where are your wings?" Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked back behind him and looked at Valia and said, "I put them away. It's not convenient to sleep with the wings here." Valia nodded and said nothing. After the two lion eagles flew for a distance, they slowly landed on the edge of a lake. Riding the Lion Eagle for a walk by the lake. Valia looked at the lake water reflecting the silver light next to her and said nothing. Chen Tao looked at Valia's tall figure and saw that she didn't speak, and Chen Tao didn't speak either. The two walked by the lake for a while, and she retracted her gaze and said, "Chen Tao, I want you to be my man." Fortunately, Chen Tao didn't drink water now, otherwise he would have to spit out a mouthful of water. Isn't this too straightforward? Chen Tao did not expect that what he thought was an illusion at the time would become real, nor did he expect that He Yuxuan's speculation would also become true. Chen Tao said, "Queen, I already have a wife." Valia said, "I know, I don't care about this. It is not uncommon for capable people to have a few confidants around them." Valia slowly looked at Chen Tao and said, "If you want, I can give you the position of the king of Qaeda. At that time, even if you want to use this king's status to find other women, I won't care." This sounds too familiar. It seems that someone had said these words to him not long ago. Chen Tao said, "This, queen, you are the queen of Qaeda, there should be many men here who are better than me. You have been the queen for so long, haven't you found one?" Valia said, "No, so far, I haven't met any man who is better than you. To be honest, I don't like any of the men in Kayada. Chen Tao blinked and looked at Valia. Valia raised her hand and looked at her gloved hand. She said, I don't know why, since I was born, I have extraordinary strength and leadership. The lion eagle slowly stopped. Seeing Valia stop, Chen Tao also stopped. Valia got off the lion eagle and walked forward. There was a tree that was thick enough for 5 adults to hold hands and hug. Valia drew out the long sword, held the long sword in her hand, and shouted, "Ha!" and waved her hand. The long sword swept across the trunk of the tree. The tree was split in half. The whole tree slowly fell down. Boom! The huge tree fell down with a loud bang. Chen Tao's eyes trembled when he saw this scene. Chen Tao always surprised others, but this time, Chen Tao couldn't help but be surprised. What is this? The trunk of the tree was so thick that even those tall and strong men like bears would probably have to chop it with a big axe for several hours before they could chop it. And this woman in front of him, just an ordinary woman, used such a thin long sword to chop such a tree in half. What kind of power is this? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 179. If the person using the sword was a warrior with second-generation genes, Chen Tao would understand. But the problem is, this woman is just a queen of a backward civilization. Without even thermal weapons, such a person cannot be a second-generation genetic warrior. But there was no way to explain the scene in front of me. Vilia slowly put away her long sword, and the big tree fell, bringing up a gust of wind, causing her blonde hair to flutter. Wei Lia turned slightly sideways, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "No one can control me with such power. In order to find someone who can control me, I even searched all over Kayada, but couldn't find it. Here no man can control Kayada." She looked at Chen Tao and said, "You appeared when I thought I could only die alone. I think this is God's will. I don't intend to give up this opportunity. I want you to be my man. Believe me, you should be able to understand." Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Valia and said, "You should know that for me, Kayada is just a place. I don't belong here, and I won't stay here. If you want to be my woman, then you have to come with me and give up being the queen of Kayada." Wei Lia said without any hesitation, "As long as you promise to be my man, I will give up if you ask me to." Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Wei Lia. Vilia said lightly, "I have no interest in being a queen. I am just a queen to find a man more conveniently." Chen Tao suddenly had an inexplicable feeling. This woman was too crazy. However, with her ability, she is indeed qualified to do this. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Is it okay?" Chen Tao adjusted his mood and said, "That's it. Just come here and tell me this and ask me to accept you. I won't be able to agree to this kind of thing for a while." Wei Lia pondered for a moment and said, "Yes, then I can give you time. I hope you can give me an answer." Chen Tao nodded slightly and said, "We'll talk about this later. I'm quite interested in your power." Interested, Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "How do you say it?" Chen Tao got off the back of the griffin and walked towards Valia. He said, "I have met many people, but I have never seen a being like you. Regarding your power, I want to analyze it and take a look. Look at the source of this power." Analysis. There was a hint of doubt in Vilia's eyes. She looked at Chen Tao doubtfully. "What does that mean?" Chen Tao said, "It is to analyze your strength through some means. You can rest assured that this analysis will not cause harm to your body." Welia looked into Chen Tao's eyes. She nodded slightly and said, "I understand. I allow you to analyze my power. I also want to know the source of my power. Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly. Time stops passing. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Wei Lia, who also turned into a blue code. Through this blue code, Chen Tao saw the genetic code that made up Wei Lia's body. Through this code, Chen Tao can judge the difference between Wei Lia and others. See this. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and his eyebrows wrinkled slightly. Weird. The genetic code of Wei Lia's body is different from that of ordinary people. The genetic code on her body is too familiar. Is this the dragon's genetic code? Why? Velia is a dragon. Chen Tao frowned slightly. Strange. In this way, Chen Tao finally understood the reason why Wei Lia possessed such terrifying power. The genes in her body are those of the second-generation dragon warriors. With this gene, it is normal to have powers beyond ordinary people. But the next question is, why does she have the genes of the second-generation dragon warrior? Where did this gene come from? Time resumes its passage. Vilia's body changed from code blue back to its previous appearance. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Then what should I do?" For Chen Tao, he has completed the analysis, but for Wei Lia, the period of time that Chen Tao just analyzed did not exist at all. Now Wei Lia wants to cooperate with Chen Tao to analyze. Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "I have finished analyzing it. Your body's genetic code is different from ordinary people's. Your genes are more powerful." Chen Tao still doesn't know about the dragon people, so he can't tell Wei Lia about the dragon people yet. Vilia frowned. "Gene, what is that?" Hearing this, Chen Tao touched the back of his head. Welia is in the cold weapon age, and there are too many things she doesn't know. It's too troublesome to explain this. Looking at Chen Tao's expression, Wei Lia's eyebrows stretched slightly, and she said, "Simply put, my body is different from ordinary people, and I have different powers. Can I understand it this way?" Chen Tao nodded slightly. Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Then do you know the source of this power?" Chen Tao said, "I probably know something, but I need to investigate to be sure." Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "After the investigation, can you tell me the results?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked into Wei Lia's serious eyes. He nodded slightly and said, "Okay." Velia looked at Chen Tao deeply, "Can you give me the answer to the previous question tomorrow morning?" Chen Tao looked at Velia, looked at her delicate face, and shook his head, "I need time, I don't think one night is enough." Velia was not disappointed or lost, but smiled, and said, "Okay, although I really want you to agree, if you agree so quickly, it will also ruin my impression of you." "Okay, let's go back." Velia strode forward and sat on the back of the lion eagle. Chen Tao followed and sat on the back of the lion eagle. The two lion eagles flew into the sky together and walked back. The two returned home. Chen Tao stood at the door. Velia looked at Chen Tao and said, "I'll go back first." Chen Tao nodded slightly. Velia went downstairs, sat on the back of the lion eagle, rode the lion eagle away, and downstairs, she left a lion eagle. Looking at the griffin tied downstairs, Chen Tao was silent for a while. He raised his head and looked at the griffin flying in the sky. It is the most difficult to enjoy the favor of a beautiful woman. What should I do? Chen Tao thought for a while and said, "Kati." Hubby, hearing that it was Chen Tao's voice, Katie's voice had a hint of joy. Chen Tao said, "Do you know Kayada?" "Kayada, I know," Katie said. Chen Tao said, "I am here in Kayada. There is a Kayada queen named Velia here. I sense the genes of the dragon warrior in her. What's going on?" Katie said, "Is it such a coincidence, you actually met her, husband?" My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 180. Chen Tao was stunned. "What do you mean? I told you before that the lonely and boring life made me live a life worse than death. For this reason, I considered taking a break for a while, but the position of the Dragon King cannot be abandoned. Then I asked the Dragon King's Academy to calculate and find the next Dragon King who is suitable for the position of the Dragon King. Kadi said, Vilya is the most suitable candidate for the Dragon King calculated by the Dragon King's Academy. Hearing this, Chen Tao frowned slightly. You said so, she is a dragon. Kadi said, yes, there are no male dragons in Dragon City. In order to reproduce, we female dragons will choose to go to other planets to find men who are suitable for them. Then give birth to children. Because the genes of female dragons are strong, the women born are likely to have dragon genes. We will wait until the time comes, find them, and then explain our identities to them. If they agree, we will take her back to Dragon City. Kadi continued, Vilya is the child of the dragon, however, her mother died when she was on a mission. Chen Tao understood. No wonder Vilya has dragon genes in her body, it turns out to be like this. Chen Tao said, what are your plans for Vilya now? Kadi said slowly, train her, and when she grows up to be able to take charge, I will give her the position of Dragon King. This is my previous plan. However, the situation has changed now. Facing the enemies outside this universe, I don't think she is mature enough to deal with them. I think now, I will let her accept the position of Dragon King after the universe stabilizes. But husband, if you are willing, I would rather you take over the position of Dragon King, so that I can rest assured, Kadi said softly. Chen Tao pondered for a moment, and he said, let's talk about this later, okay? Well, Kadi's voice was much gentler. Chen Tao hung up the call. For Kadi now, what she probably wants to do most is to let Chen Tao manage Dragon City. This is not only to maintain the balance of Dragon City, but also to fight against foreign invaders. After all, the threat to the universe they are in now does not come from within the universe, but from outside the universe. The technology possessed by the terrifying enemies outside the universe is not something that the current dragon civilization can resist. The dragon civilization now needs more powerful technology, and what Chen Tao has is exactly what they need. Chen Tao certainly knows what Katie thinks, but it is too difficult for him to manage the Dragon City. Chen Tao thought about it and felt that it was necessary to solve this problem. He can only wait until the next time he finds Katie to solve it. Chen Tao opened the door and returned to the room. In the room, He Yuxuan was lying on the bed with her eyes closed, and had taken a nap. Chen Tao took off his shoes, got on the bed, and slowly hugged He Yuxuan into his arms. He gently hugged her and accompanied her to rest. He Yuxuan's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes. The corners of her mouth rose slightly, and her mood became a little more joyful. She slowly moved closer to Chen Tao's arms. The two fell asleep leaning against each other. The next morning, Chen Tao and He Yuxuan came downstairs. But found downstairs, Vilya was already riding the lion eagle, waiting there. Seeing Chen Tao and He Yuxuan coming down, Vilya smiled and said, "Are we going back?" Seeing Vilya in front of him, Chen Tao was slightly startled. Vilya changed her clothes. She was wearing a tight leather jacket and leather pants. This outfit fit her figure perfectly. Her waist was held tightly, her upper body was amazing, and her legs were slender and straight. She had long golden hair, a pair of deep blue eyes, and a delicate and perfect oval face. Without wearing armor, she perfectly showed her proud figure in front of Chen Tao. Very beautiful. She can be regarded as a great beauty. Chen Tao came back to his senses. He turned over and sat on the lion eagle beside him. He looked at He Yuxuan beside him, and stretched out his hand. He Yuxuan raised her hand and held Chen Tao's hand. Chen Tao's hand exerted a little force, and He Yuxuan was pulled onto the back of the lion eagle and sat down. She put her little hand around Chen Tao's waist. Chen Tao held the reins and looked at Vilya. Vilya smiled and said, "Walk with me before you leave." Vilya pulled the reins, and the lion eagle flapped its wings and flew into the sky. Chen Tao also controlled the lion eagle to fly up. Chen Tao looked at Valia beside him. From this angle, he could see Valia's amazing figure. He retracted his gaze and said, "I found the source of your power." Valia was slightly startled, and she looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "Your mother does not belong to your world. She is from the sky like me. She is a warrior from the sky. Her body has a different power from ordinary people, and you inherited her power." Valia frowned. "Mother." She retracted her gaze and said, "Do you know her?" "Well." Chen Tao looked at Valia. Valia frowned, and her expression became a little angry. Chen Tao said, "Do you hate your mother?" Valia's eyebrows relaxed slightly. "She abandoned me not long after I was born. Not only do I hate her, I also hate her. But I didn't expect that my strength actually came from her." Valia looked at her hands. Seeing the change in Valia's expression, Chen Tao said, "She is a pure warrior. She loves your father, but at the same time she also has her own mission. Just for that mission, she has paid the price of her life and sacrificed." Wei Lia's face darkened. She frowned and looked at Chen Tao. "My mother is dead." "Who did it?" There was a hint of anger in her voice. Valia, who had always been calm before, was now like a furious beast. Chen Tao could feel her anger, and Wei Lia wanted revenge. Although her mother abandoned her, blood is thicker than water and she still has feelings, right? Chen Tao pondered for a moment. Wei Lia clenched her fists. She slowly calmed down her emotions, looked away, and said, "I'm sorry." Seeing this, Chen Tao also withdrew his gaze and looked ahead. "I don't know who did it, but I know why your mother died. She died for the balance of the universe and to protect the universe." "I don't understand," Valia said. "What is the universe, and what is the balance of the universe?" She was just the king of the cold weapon age. Their technology was not enough for them to understand this, so it was normal for her not to know. Chen Tao said, "I will tell you after this. Maybe now is not the time." Hearing this, Wei Lia turned her head and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked back at Wei Lia and said, "That's all I have to tell you for now, so it's time for me to leave." Wei Lia was slightly startled, and she said, "Chen Tao, if you leave, how should I find you?" Her eyes were gleaming, and she was a little panicked.